Yo guys, what is up? Max here, Diablo for a video, and today we're going over my Blightsplosion Necromancer build. Now, I put this together for patch 1.1.1, which buffed the damage over time Necromancer, and that is what we're going to be scaling. This is a darkness damage over time build that is really smooth to play. This is my first time playing Necromancer for this season. I've played a lot of Druid, I've played a lot of Barb, and I'm having so much fun. This build is really smooth. We put it together on some like basic gear, and we were doing Nightmare Dungeons 30 levels higher than us. A lot of the gameplay that you're going to see for this is me doing Nightmare Dungeons 30 levels higher. I think we're going to easily be able to do Nightmare 100s, and I've just been having so much fun. The visual effects of this build, all the explosion, it's just really satisfying. And one of my favorite things about it is it's got a ton of survivability. You can basically ignore so many annoying Nightmare Dungeon modifiers, so many annoying Nightmare Dungeon enemies. It feels really good to play, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. I hope you all enjoyed the video and the full breakdown. Let's get right into it. Real quick before we get into the video, this is my first Necromancer build on the channel. This game has been out for 2+ months. There's been a lot of Necromancer builds. I know that I'm not the first to do this, and I know that people have posted similar builds before me. This is my original take that we came up on stream together. In Theory Crafted, chat helped me out a ton because I am newer to Necromancer, but I wanted to share it with you guys. I will have credits. A streamer named EchoHack put out quite a similar build to what we're doing here. We're doing some things different, so I wanted to share my version of the build, but credits to them in the description as well. So this build has a lot of moving pieces, and I kind of want to break them down. So to start us off, Shadow Blight is a very important part of this build. Shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds. You and your minions deal 10% bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions while they are affected by Shadow Blight, they take an additional up to 2,300% shadow damage. Now, this shadow damage seems to scale with our damage multipliers, whether that be it can crit, so giving it crit chance, crit damage, vulnerable damage, shadow damage, darkness skill damage, seems to all scale with it, which allows this, even though it's a smaller number, to actually start hitting pretty hard. So this is a big chunk of our damage, is that we're going to be dealing shadow damage a lot very quickly, so this is constantly proccing on all of our enemies. And note that this can critically strike, meaning that this can start our barber procs on enemies, and it procs very often. So to pair with this, we're going to be using the Lidless Wall unique. Now, this is a brand new unique this season, and it reads, while you have an active Bone Storm, hitting an unaffected enemy has a up to 25% chance to spawn an additional storm at their location. Each of your active sacrifice bonuses increases the chance by 25%, and the total additional bone storms you can have by +1. Now, I'm sacrificing 2 minions on this build, so I've got at base a 70% chance whenever we lucky hit with Bone Storm to activate another Bone Storm. Now, if we go into our skill tree, we can see that Bone Storm has a ridiculously high lucky hit chance at a 52% chance, and it's going to be spinning everywhere. It's going to be hitting a ton of enemies. Paired with that, we're also going to be making it a darkness skill. So all of our bone storms are going to be hovering around us. We're pairing it with the barrier aspect, so it's going to be giving us a ton of survivability, and it's going to be proccing a lot of hits and a lot of lucky hits. This is going to constantly giving us the Shadow Blight explosions on our enemies, and more importantly, it's going to pair really well with Decrepify. Now, Decrepify in the new season, you can get a heart for it that allows Decrepify to be on you at all times. I've got this. When at least one enemy is near you, you gain an aura that automatically curses surrounding enemies with Decrepify for 15 seconds. This is constantly on us, and it's got a lucky hit chance. Enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify have up to a 15% chance to reduce your active skill cooldowns by 1 second. What this allows us to do is basically have close to 100% uptime of Bone Storm, which once again is doing a ton of damage because it's proccing all these Shadow Blights, and it's also going to be up on us all the time. In addition to that, we can actually cast Blood Mist and then go into Bone Storm. So we are going to be blazing through enemies. We're going to be scaling a ton of move speed on this build. While we're in Blood Mist, we cannot take damage, and Blood Mist is going to be consuming corpses on this build. Blood Mist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses. When Blood Mist detonates a corpse, its cooldown is reduced. So we've got cooldown reduced for Blood Mist. We're also going to be using Blood Mist as a shadow trail. So it's going to be also exploding these corpses, doing its own shadow damage. It's going to be consuming corpses, it's also constantly proccing Shadow Blight. And I know I'm saying a lot of things, but what this build comes down to is you're going to go into your Blood Mist, or you're going to cast Bone Storm, and then you're just going to like beeline it through enemies with Blood Mist. You're going to be dropping corpses, exploding those corpses. Your Bone Storms are going to be hitting everything, giving you that lucky hit, refreshing all of your cooldowns. And I found that I basically do a Blood Mist. When I come out of it, I get another Blood Mist. And by the time I do another Blood Mist, my Bone Storm is already back. And because we're using the heart that automatically detonates our corpse explosions, we're just an auto bomber build. This is basically an auto bomber build from like Path of Exile, where we're going to be auto casting corpse tendrils to pull enemies in, stun them, make them vulnerable. Corpse explosion is going to be going off. That's going to deal a ton of damage. We're scaling a lot of dodge, and it's also going to give us more Shadow Blight procs. And then every once in a while, we can just throw in a Reap to get more corpses. This build is so smooth to play, and it gives a ridiculous amount of survivability. Now let's go over gear specifics. I'm going to be going through each piece of gear that I'm wearing. I'm going to show you what I'm wearing, and I'll also have the stat priorities for what I think would be a god roll, because obviously I don't have great gear yet. So on our helmet, I think you're going to want to look for a lot of quality of life and survivability. Getting armor really good, getting health really good, cooldown reduction really good, and I think you could get ranks of Decrepify on your helmet. I don't think it's needed, but the more ranks to Decrepify you get on us, the more slow we deal to enemies, and the more damage reduction or the less damage that the enemies deal that are hit by Decrepify. Once again, we're kind of immune all the time, so I don't think it's totally important. Next up, on your chest piece, ideally you're looking for quad damage reduction here. I've found that while I'm leveling, I can actually get away on this build with a damaged chest piece, and I never do this on any character. Obviously, for higher tier content, you're going to want to look for like quad damage reduction or triple damage reduction with armor. But right now I've got darkness skill damage, total armor, shadow damage, and like I'm actually getting away with it in 30 tiers higher content than I am, just because we're basically immune most of the time that we're on this build. So that's pretty crazy. The aspect that you're going to want to look for is the Blood Mist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses. When Blood Mist detonates a corpse, its cooldown is reduced. This is a must-have. This is what's going to allow you to permanently be in Blood Mist, and you'll note that I have the bare minimum of this roll. Also, Disobedience on your helmet, really nice. You're going to want to be getting all that armor, and the more like percent armor rolls that you have on your gear, the more that the Disobedience is going to do for you. For our gloves, because we're not using a core skill, we can get away with using the unique gloves Howl from Below. Now, these have been dropping kind of like candy for me on this Necromancer. I've already seen 3 of them, but they read, instead of detonating immediately, Corpse Explosion summons a volatile skeleton that charges at a random enemy and explodes. Corpse Explosion damage is increased by up to 40%. Now, one, this is awesome. You're going to see these skeletons just screaming across the screen everywhere, running into enemies and exploding, and they're going to use your like points and your like things that you've spec'd on Corpse Explosion. So because we're spec'd into Blighted Corpse Explosion, they are going to be dropping those big AoE dots. It's going to give us more damage, but it's also going to give us quality of life, because if an enemy isn't right on top of a corpse, that corpse will go to them. So this gloves feel really, really good. I need to do some more testing with some like more quality of life non-unique gloves, but these are just so awesome. I like them a lot, and they roll with lucky hit chance and corpse skill attack speed and chance to stun and chance to fear, which are actually pretty nice. The more CCs that we have, the more damage that we're going to be doing to enemies. Next up, on your pants, this is really important. We're going to be going as much damage reduction as you can, armor if you can, and most importantly, ranks of Corpse Explosion. Corpse Explosion, while not being like probably the biggest damage source of this build, is still doing a lot of damage for us, and having that damage from Corpse Explosion feels really good. We've got like 12 points into it right now. And then on our pants, we've got each time that Bone Storm damages an enemy, gain barrier equal to 5% of your base life, up to 5%. Just getting this aspect alone, you're going to notice that it becomes very hard to die when Bone Storm is up, which is really awesome, because Bone Storm's going to be up most of the time. For your boot slot, you actually have a few options, with the most important thing being movement speed. And if you can get movement speed plus movement speed after killing an elite, this build is really going to start to zoom. The more movement speed that you have, the faster you're going to be able to move in Blood Mist. If you can get ranks of Corpse Tendrils, that's great, and then probably like a substat for your Paragon board. Either dexterity, willpower, or intelligence would all be really great to have. You do also have some unique options. The Penitent Greaves are kind of cool. While they can't roll double move speed, you're going to get even more damage to enemies. You're going to leave a trail behind you that chills enemies, and you can leave that trail while you're in Blood Mist. You're just getting 10x or 10% more damage while you're wearing these to basically all the enemies that you're fighting, so that's really nice. The other option is Greaves of the Empty Tomb. These drop with movement speed, essence cost reduction, lucky hit chance with shadow damage, and damage reduction from enemies that are affected by shadow damage, and it's going to leave like damage over time puddles from your severs. This is really cool, and if you want to run those boots, you can actually move some points into the sever skill. I haven't messed around with this yet because they haven't dropped for me, so I can't recommend those boots yet, but Sever with those boots sounds like it'd be a really cool addition to the build, and then you would just not use a basic skill. You would just get rid of Reap. Next up for our weapon, you're going to want to use a wand. The reason we're using wands is because they have base lucky hit chance. Lucky hit chance is quite important for this build, as it's going to make sure that our skills are always off cooldown, and you want to have your skills off cooldown to survive on this build. I've got vulnerable damage, damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies, intelligence, and damage over time. Now, the one thing that I wasn't super understanding when I was first putting this together is that even though I didn't grab it here, a crit damage can actually be quite nice for this build just because this Shadow Blight damage can crit. I think the God Roll weapon is going to be vulnerable, intelligence, a dot like damage to affected shadow damage over time enemies is going to be really good. And then lastly, crit damage. I do think crit damage would be quite good for this build, even though we are using mainly dots. But this is the weapon I've got. And then we've got the aspect: each time the Shadow Blight's key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 31%. Once again, I've got a bad roll, up to 45%, stacking up to 5 times. We're going to be proccing Shadow Blight like crazy with this build, really, really fast. And so you're going to see this ramp up damage all the time. It's just really nice. For our jewelry, I've got a pretty crap amulet. The important things that you're looking for are movement speed. Once again, Necro, slow. You want movement speed. It's going to make the character feel better. I do have a movement speed after killing an elite roll here. I'd rather just get flat movement speed to just feel speedy all the time. And then I'm also shooting for +3 ranks into corpse skills, and then one of our passives. Now, we have a lot of different passives that would be great that can roll on amulets. I have not found a perfect one myself, but if you can find a passive that gives you, or an amulet that gives you points into amplified damage, that's going to be really good. If you can get an amulet that gives you points into gloom, this is the best in slot. Gloom is the absolute best amulet roll that you could get. Terror would also be really good, and so would Fueled by Death. If you can get an amulet with ranks into corpse skills, plus movement, plus one of these, either Amplify, Terror, Gloom, or Fueled by Death, you're going to be sitting really pretty. And then lastly, I'd probably go for either cooldown or like an armor or damage reduction, probably armor, roll on that amulet. On our ring here, I've got damage to enemies affected by shadow damage over time, shadow damage, crit chance, and vulnerable damage. Now, the one thing to understand about all of these damage things is they're all additive. So shadow damage is additive with close damage, is additive with shadow damage over time enemies. It's all in the same damage bucket. So what you're looking for, ideally in a perfect world, is things that are going to be active for everything. For example, damage to close enemies would be active if we're close to enemies, which we're going to be all the time. For our dot damage, should be active for the proc of the dot damage, should be active for the barber damage, should be active for like everything. So you're wanting to look for things that are going to be active all the time. For example, you don't actually want damage over time on this build, ideally, because it's only going to like increase the damage of one of your damage instances, which is the dot, and we've got a lot of damage instances going on. So you're looking for conditional damage multipliers that are going to be up for all of your damage. So vulnerable damage is really great, lucky hits great, crit chance is good, crit damage is good, and like for example, shadow damage or darkness skill damage is also going to be really good because it's going to apply to a lot of things versus like the very specific part of the corpse explosion dot, if that makes sense. On my other ring, I've got crit chance, vulnerable, lucky hit chance, and damage to stunned enemies. And then for our hearts, we get into a little bit of a longer discussion. So the big choice of heart here for your Wrathful is either the Barber, which is going to allow whenever we crit for all of our damage to be stored and then store that damage and then erupt, or we can use the heart, the Creeping Death. This gives our damage over times 40% increased damage for each different crowd control effect on the target. And then against bosses, we're going to get 144% multiplicative dot damage increase if they get staggered. Now, from my testing, I found that the Barber is significantly better for bossing than the stagger damage, because bosses are not staggered for very long, and even when they are staggered, sometimes you don't have a corpse up, or you just don't have enough corpses to really like take advantage of this window. But I found that this heart that stacks the dot, the creeping death, is really good for harder content, because the damage over time gets to build up on enemies. Damage over time stacks every instance, and so when you're fighting enemies that are really hard, that have a lot of health, you're going to be able to actually see the effects of this. And I was seeing my dot damage at level 78 tick for over 800,000 damage a tick, or a total. Shadow damage over time ticks twice a second, so I was seeing like 480,000 damage procs, so over 800,000 damage from dot damage a second, which is crazy. And we were getting that and seeing that with this heart. So for harder enemies, I really like this. For bosses and easier enemies, the Barber is so amazing because it's just going to explode everything. It's really good against bosses. If you were only to use one Wrathful Heart, I think the Barber is probably the overall better pick. The Barber is going to be better for the Shadow Blight version of this build. It's going to help the Shadow Blight more, and obviously the Creeping Death is going to help the Corpse Explosion and the damage over time from Corpse Explosion a lot more. I do think the Barber is slightly better, but it's not like a this is always better 99% of the time. So yeah, you do have an option there. Both are really good. But with the changes to Barber, the Barber is no longer like making us lose lucky hit chance. And so the downsides of this thing are kind of gone now, which means it's really good to use. For the Book of the Dead, we're going to be sacrificing our Skeletal Warriors so that we deal increased shadow damage. For the Skeletal Mages, we're going to be using the Cold Skeletal Mages to give us increased vulnerable damage, which is really nice. And then for the Golem, we're going to be using the Blood Golem, absorbs 15% of the damage you would take. Note that this is apparently really good. I haven't done the damage testing myself, but apparently this is absorbing or taking into account your like damage reduction once. So you're going to go through your basically defense formula before all of this applies, and then that damage is then going to go through here, and then that's going to get reduced by 15%. So you're getting like double reduced damage when you have this spec. So it's going to give you a lot less damage taken than it initially implies, which seems really, really good. You don't think you would need this if you're like really just trying to blast low tier content. You could just go for the more health that this gives you, or the more crit damage for the Shadow Blights. But note that that does kind of work against the Lidless Wall a little bit. We still have the Lidless Wall up all the time, but you could get another chance for this Lidless Wall to proc if you don't spec the Golems. So for like most content, I think it's fine to have. If you're wanting to just blast content and like not doing anything too challenging, you could just go for the crit damage, and then you would have more Lidless Walls and more crit damage, but you would lose a decent chunk of survivability by taking that off. For our skill tree, we're going Reap, and Reap summons a corpse. This is just nice for bosses. You just swing it a few times. It gets the ball rolling. Every time I come out of the mist, I like to do a swing of Reap. Make sure that I'm doing that. It only occurs once every 4 seconds, and so we're in Infinimist for like 3 seconds, so you come out of it, just swing this once. It'll give you a corpse, and it helps snowball all of your damage. So we're going 3 points there. We are skipping core skills entirely. We are going Hewed Flesh. Your damage has up to a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. Very nice. We've got a lot of lucky hit, and this is going to spam corpses with the Bone Storm lucky hit chance, which is great. Then we're going points into Blood Mist. You could take 1 point out of Corpse Explosion, put it in Blood Mist. I'm finding that I've Blood Mist up pretty much all the time. So we got 4 out of 5 into Blood Mist, and we really want Blood Mist to leave corpses behind us. And then Corpse Explosion becomes a Darkness skill. Here we've got 1 point into Grim Harvest. We don't really care about Essence because we're not using core skills. We're just trying to get down for Fueled by Death, which is going to give us increased damage after consuming a corpse. Then we've got the Amplified damage. You deal increased damage to cursed enemies, which is literally everything. We've got Death's Embrace. We deal more damage to close enemies and take less damage from them. We've got Decrepify and the lucky hit for cooldowns. This is so nice. And then Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils makes enemies vulnerable. And then we get these. This is our like big damage passive node. So this is going to give us Reaper's Pursuit. When we hit enemies with darkness skills, we get more movement speed. Movement speed, very good on Necromancer. Gloom, when you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take 6% increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. This is going to be up at 3 stacks basically all the time, which is why it is the best passive to get your amulet on. Then we've got Terror. Darkness skills deal increased damage to enemies who are slowed. We have guaranteed slows from our Decrepify, and it's going to deal increased damage to enemies who are stunned or immobilized. This has a chance to stun enemies with Lucky Hit once again, and we've got another chance to stun enemies there. So enemies are going to be getting hit by this all the time. Then we've got Necrotic Carapace. This is going to give us Fortify. We're not really doing too much with Fortify, so if you were to lose any points in this build somewhere and wanted to put them elsewhere, I would take them out of this. But more Fortify is going to give us that more damage reduction, and because we're immune most of the time, we can actually keep this up quite often. Then we're grabbing our Sacrifice bonuses because we are not using too many minions. We are going to be using the Golem, but we're getting the Sacrifice bonuses from our Skeletal Mages and Warriors. And then we're going to increase those bonuses by 60%, grabbing Bone Storm, and then our Shadow Blight. The big thing to talk about with our Paragon board is actually what they just buffed. So I'm obviously pretty low level, so there's not too much to talk about and show you with my Paragon board. But this node is awesome. This just got buffed in patch 1.1.1. If you've ever thought about making a Shadowmancer, this is a great reason to do so. Your shadow damage over time effects have a 5% chance to deal 50% bonus damage each time they deal damage, which is constantly hitting all the time. And this chance is increased by 1%, and bonus damage is increased by 4% for each 40 willpower you have. We're not stacking up too much willpower quite yet. We will have a ton once this build is done, but we're also getting more chance for that big explosion to happen, and we're going to be stacking up more willpower. This was just buffed, so that's really, really nice. The rest of my board, I only have 3 glyphs in right now, and I don't have too much of the board planned out. On dpscheck.gg, you can find a full board Paragon version filled out, but right now I am going to be using the Darkness glyph. This gives us whenever you or your minions deal shadow damage to an enemy, that enemy deals 2% reduced damage, just more survivability for us, and it increases our shadow damage, which is awesome. The Exploit glyph, whenever we deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, we get increasing of our damage, which is going to be the Corpse Tendrils all the time, and we deal increased damage to, or increased vulnerable damage. Then we've got the Scourge. This is going to give us increased shadow damage over time, and our minions deal 10% increased damage, or you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies affected by shadow damage over time effects, which is basically everything. In our actual Paragon boards, once again, this is really far from finished just because we're still very much leveling, but this is a good direction to go. When you are leveling your Paragon board, just like a general tip, your glyphs aren't going to do very much for you when you're starting out, so that's why we're grabbing legendary nodes, and we're prioritizing legendary nodes. Once you get further into the game, once you're level 85, 90, that's when your glyphs really start to really do great things for you, and you can stop prioritizing legendary nodes. But legendary nodes early are really nice. The legendary nodes that we've got is Wither, and then in our first board we've got the shadow damage over time, or the darkness glyph. Our first board we've got the exploit glyph. We're grabbing damage reduction from enemies, we're grabbing shadow damage over time, we're grabbing damage to enemies affected by shadow damage over time, and elites, which is really nice. Then we're going up to the flesh eater board. Consuming 5 corpses grants us 40% increased damage for 6 seconds, basically up all the time, and then more shadow damage over time with the scourge glyph here. We're getting more damage to elites, damage to injured enemies, and crit damage there. And then we're coming over to the Scent of Death board. With at least 2 corpses nearby, you gain damage reduction. With no corpses nearby, you deal 15% increased damage. We're also grabbing some more damage to healthy enemies and crit damage here. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I hope you enjoyed. It's now 4 a.m. here, so I'm going to go to bed. But if you haven't played Necromancer, this is a really great season. I can't imagine the Necromancer feeling as good this next season as it does this season, because of the just sheer quality of life that the hearts bring to it. This build, while having a lot of things automated for it, is just so satisfying and fun to play. You get to ignore so many things that kill you on other characters just because you're immune half the time, and all the explosions, all the things are crazy. Every time I've joined a friend with this build, they're like, what the heck is going on with all of these explosions everywhere? It's just a really visually satisfying build, and it's obviously very, very powerful. That is it for the video. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.